welcome to The Relationship Edge, a podcast where we explore the power of relationships in the private markets. Joined today by Sabrina Merage Naim. Sabrina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We're really excited for today's conversation. I have to say, and maybe the place we'll start, is that it's rare to have another podcast host, especially one that's like a much more successful podcast host than me, with me. And so excited, probably a little intimidated, but it'll be great. And so in that lens, I'd love to hear what you think podcasting has taught you as you've gone through the number of different podcasts you've built and hosted.
Yeah, well, it's funny. It kind of started like as a side hustle where I wanted to do something a little different than anything I'd done before. I wanted to flex a different muscle than I'd experienced before, and so I got involved in a show back in 2020 called Breaking Glass, where we got to have these really amazing conversations with people all over the world to talk about women's issues. Ranging the gamut from titans of industry to people who have been abused or experienced civil war in their respective countries, just anything that you can imagine that women are dealing with. And one of the things that I really appreciated about that experience was that I was exposed to people that I would never otherwise be exposed to. I was having conversations with people that I never would have crossed paths with otherwise. I was delving into topics that I really hadn't I didn't have a lot of exposure to. So for me, it has opened up a world that I didn't have before. And it's also really fun. I mean, it just is. It's really fun. I don't know if you experience that as well, but for me, having these conversations and digging into interesting topics and exploring the curiosity, it's fun.
Yeah, no, I really enjoy it. Lifelong learner is probably one of the characteristics that I guess I place upon myself. And books, podcasts, all those sorts of things are great, or ones that I'm just consuming. But the opportunity to sit with people on maybe the other side of the screen in this case and hear directly from their experiences and dive more deeply into those questions has been just a phenomenal experience. So I 100% agree.
Yeah, and I would also say that I've managed to kind of transition that to a new show called A Fine Mess, which I launched just recently and has been even more well received and more inspirational and broadening the audience to important issues that we're facing today as a society from a place of curiosity instead of dread, right? That's kind of the tagline. And so being able to take those internal characteristics that we have, like you are a lifelong learner, I come at things from a place of curiosity, and then creating a whole show around it and bringing experts and people who can speak to specific topics. It's just, I think, one of the most inspiring ways to learn about the world we live in.
I totally believe it. You probably love all your babies equally, so to speak. I'm curious if you have a favorite episode or maybe even a favorite topic you've covered across those different lenses.
So I have a new episode that's going to be coming out pretty soon, which I was just editing, so it's top of mind for me, but I also really, really love it and I'm excited for it. And it's about what we've learned after 10 years of cannabis legalization in Colorado. And I had the opportunity to speak with Senator John Hickenlooper, who was the governor of Colorado at the time, and his kind of right hand man, the cannabis czar, and they created really the legislation that the rest of the country has followed suit. And having that conversation with the two people who were like really at the ground level of that and understanding what went right, what went wrong, where have they learned, what has happened since then, was fascinating for me. So I'm excited for people to hear about that one.
Yeah, no. And it also sounds like it's a bit of a mix of a couple different worlds that you live in, if I'm thinking about this correctly. So I know one of the many professions or one of the many experiences you've had as one of the investors and leaders at Echo Capital Group. And I believe that you all were one of the first early investors into the cannabis space. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it was interesting. We were very careful early on not to invest in companies that touched the flower very, intimately. And so it was, or I would say firsthand. So we were looking at We were looking at companies that were kind of third party, or, we looked at distributors, we looked at data collection companies and data aggregators. And so we weren't investing in growers. It's still really the wild, wild west. This is something that I speak about in this episode. Even all these years later, without federal legalization, without a central banking system, it's still the wild, wild west. So we kind of trudged into it um, cautiously, I would say, and learned a whole lot of lessons because it is so tied to the economy, to how people are doing economically, and COVID really hit that market significantly, substantially hit that market. But it was so fascinating because it's really like a different world. And Echo Capital Group, which is a VC investor in consumer product companies, it was a little different than what we had done before. Normally, we invest in food and beverage, beauty, apparel, all those kinds of things. And cannabis related investments were a risk. It was fun. It was interesting. It was educational. Um, there's a lot of potential and opportunity and upside, but I think what I learned was that there were a lot of people who were trying to get in at the ground floor who had no idea what they were doing. And that's where you kind of sometimes fall flat on your face.
Yeah. To your point around the decade of lessons to be learned, I have to imagine there's
Absolutely.
like the societal lessons and also the lessons for investors and entrepreneurs in that as well.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting. Already in this conversation, I feel like we've touched on maybe the multi-hyphenate nature of your career and characteristics. And one of the common questions we ask on this podcast is for someone who's had so many different sorts of experiences that operates in so many different spheres, I'm curious how you thought about maintaining and building that network relationship in each one of those lenses.
Well, let me go back to the VC world because I think that's a really important characteristic. Having the ability to walk into a highly competitive world, where back then, especially less so now, but when I started in the VC world, it was 2010, and I would go to conferences or networking events all over the country, and I was very often one of few women in the room. I was always the youngest person in the room at that point, and very few people of color. And so, I felt a little bit like I was a novelty, and particularly at that time in the consumer product space, everyone was desperate to figure out what millennial consumers were looking for, how to capture that consumer demographic. And I was kind of checking the boxes of all of those demographics. Like, I was young, I was a millennial, I was a woman, I was a person of color, and everyone came to me like, what can we do? How can we? And what I realized very quickly is that developing authentic, organic relationships is the only way to be successful. And that is true across all of the hyphenates that you refer to. I work in the media space, I work in nonprofits, I work in VC and finance. And the truth of the matter is, I think when you develop authentic relationships and network from a place of authenticity, then it gives back it in dividends, right? You find very quickly that the people that you develop authentic relationships with are the ones that you will eventually do business with and eventually become successful with, and it's really a two-way road, and it's mutually beneficial. And so for me, it always came down to, I'm not looking at you for, what can you offer me? If we're developing a relationship, it needs to come from a place of authenticity so that I know one day I'm going to step up for you, you're going to step up for me at another point. It's mutually beneficial and we all win together. It's kind of the whole like all the rising ships analogy.
Yeah. And so you've then spoken of the dividends that that authentic relationship building has maybe given or have generated for you. I'm curious, What's the single biggest win that you can kind of think back to that you can attribute back to relationships or back to people that you know, maybe in the lens of investing?
Yeah. Particularly in the in the investing world, when I started Echo Capital, it was at a time when most VC and P folks were industry agnostic, opportunistic, didn't have any operational background or experience, and they were mostly like button up finance guys and had LPs um, that they had to report to and pay back within a certain timeline, and that was their main motivation. And I came at it from a very different perspective. My perspective was I want my main kind of quote unquote shareholder to be my portfolio companies, and I consider them my partners. And so when I'm getting into bed with one of these guys, like I need to know it's not just a good deal and that the fundamentals are sound, which of course that needs to be number one, but that we vibe, right? That I understand who you are as a person, who you are as a manager, where are the areas that maybe you lack experience, and how can I help fill that for you, right? How can I shore that up? As an organization, a lot of the companies that we invested with were young entrepreneurs that didn't have a lot of track record. What I liked about that was that um, they were hungry, right? They were scrappy. They knew that they had to put everything into it. They weren't kind of career operators that jumped from one place to another. These were entrepreneurs that were really putting everything into it. And so we would have very real conversations early on about I'm not Silent Capital. I'm going to be your partner. Let's figure out how to make this mutually beneficial so that when you need me, I'll step up for you. But I know that you're going to pour everything you have into this. And those were the kinds of relationships that I really developed early on, and I put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into. And I didn't go to them and say, if I'm going to help you, I don't know, develop a marketing strategy, then I expect extra equity for it. I know a lot of people do that, and you can get away with that. What I was doing was I was putting a lot of the resource and time into the end of the relationship with the hope and expectation that when we all come out of this, they're going to make me whole because they saw that we stepped up for them and that we really as an equity partner went above and beyond.
Makes complete sense to me. And I know one of the things you were mentioning in that laying of the foundation for those sorts of authentic relationships, because they lead to these sorts of outcomes, was just wanting to spend time with people and ensuring that those relationships truly were not transactional, but instead built on the true relationship between people. I'm curious, like what tactics or maybe how you operationalize that strategy.
Yeah, I would be very transparent with people from the front end. And I would say, these are my areas of strength. These are the ways that I can really leverage my back office support, my experience, my knowledge, my resource. And this is what I can do for you. This is what I'm expecting in return. You're right. And so, although that I recognize that that sounds transactional, what ended up happening was it was laying the foundation of a very open, transparent relationship from day one. And I would step up for them in that way. And so, from a tactical standpoint, I would be very clear about I'm not, I can't be the be all end all for you. But here are the 5 things that I can do really well, and this is where when you know that you need these 5 things, that's when you come to me.
Yeah, sounds like it's from a foundation of, as you described, transparency and clarity. It almost reminds me of the saying I've heard in a different realm that like discipline is freedom, which those two things seem like they're in tension in the same way that you're saying, because maybe it sounds transactional, but it does sound like the clarity you were able to give around like how you can help and the ways in which you can be useful allowed for, the foundation of a really authentic relationship to spring. And so that's really cool to hear.
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And so, as you kind of have gone about the building of those relationships long term, I'm curious how as you've seen others operate in these industries, what lessons you've seen around how people try to build relationships that people get wrong. So what's the single biggest like approach or challenge that you've seen people have to navigate that they tend to struggle with that you think is a misconception or a bad practice?
Yeah, well, I think we kind of touched on one, which is coming at it from a transactional nature, right? If you are trying to develop a relationship uh, with already an agenda, then it's not going to work because most people see through that very quickly, and it doesn't feel real, and it doesn't feel natural, and it's just not something that you want to put time into. If you come at it from a place of, I genuinely recognize the benefit and value to developing relationships in my field without any agenda, then you're going to, like we said, it's going to pay off in dividends. Um, I also just think people can be a little limiting about how to capitalize on relationships in their lives. For example, there are a lot of ways that the people who maybe in your mind fit into one category that can actually move across categories. And so being open to the possibility that like that one person in your life who's always just been business actually maybe can have some personal benefit to you and vice versa, or has only been, in the legal, I'm just giving an example. This one person that I've only dealt with from a legal standpoint actually has a lot of financial background, and being able to kind of cross the transom of the different categories, it takes a particular skill to be able to recognize in people how you can continue to develop those relationships in a broader sense. I think that's a very valuable skill to have. The other thing that I'll say is people who safeguard their relationships and are very like proprietary about the relationships that they have, I think that's a really big mistake. Though those who are generous with introductions are the ones who it comes back to you tenfold. The people who are generous with their network, it always pays back. So I would say don't safeguard your relationships. Be really open, be very generous.
Incredible tips, incredible ways of thinking about relationship building, both in the short run, but also over the course of a career. One of the other things that maybe this conversation has, allowed me to recognize is a lot of the work you've done, and not only in venture, but also through your media work, even in philanthropy, and how you've spoken about that philanthropy publicly, is storytelling. And one way I think about storytelling is like relationship building at scale, right? Because it gives you an opportunity to tell the message and spread the message and get people to get to know you without necessarily the direct one-on-one engagement. I'm curious if you have any tips in general on storytelling for, particularly for younger people in their careers, that oftentimes are people in finance and who are younger in their careers tend to be a lot of the folks who listen to this podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective. I do think one of the reasons why I was so drawn to storytelling is because it's a way that we connect with people, right? And it does. We develop our own relationships with each individual story and each character in the stories, and it can change you, right? When you are touched by a story that feels so deep and real and meaningful, it can genuinely change you. And so I come at it from that perspective of, again, I keep coming back to this word, but it's really true, is authenticity. So when I think about the stories that have the deep impact that I'm looking for and that evoke the emotions to the surface and connect you to a character or story, it's really about authenticity. And I've seen so often the stories or shows or films or whatever it is that fall flat is because it feels fake and you don't see yourself reflected in that. The stories where we see our real lives reflected back at us are the ones where we connect more. And so to me, whether that is in scripted media or unscripted media, I think there is a way to show the world in an authentic, beautiful, meaningful, deep, personal related way. And that's how you bring people along.
Yeah, it's an incredible perspective and one that I'm going to take away from this podcast for sure. Well, Sabrina, this has been an awesome podcast and an awesome conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. If the audience wants to learn more about you, your work, follow what you're doing online and in general, where can they find you?
We are evokemedia.com, and on Instagram, we are Evoke Media.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again, Sabrina, and we're super excited to continue following your journey.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.